Hello and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar. We talk about military history from ancient times to modern and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez and thank you for listening. And as a bonus, at the end of this episode, I have a clip from my Technology in Space podcast where I speak with former astronaut John B. Herrington, and a clip from my Full Contact Nerd podcast where I speak to comic book writer and post-apocalypse novel writer M.R. Carey. Again, thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Rob Havers and Todd DePastino, creators of Drawing Fire, the editorial cartoons of Bill Mauldin, published by Pritzker Military Museum and Library, available September 15th, 2020. Thank you both for speaking with me.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, our pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
So first, Rob, how did you get into studying this subject and being a part of this project?
Well, Chris, thanks very much for having us on today. My background is really an academic historian, military historian, taught at the British Military Academy in the UK, came to the US, and sort of segued into public history and run a couple of other organizations, came to the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in Chicago, which has a wonderful mission, which is to acquire and maintain an accessible collection of materials and to develop appropriate programs focusing on the citizen soldier in the preservation of democracy. And upon arriving at this institution, I was delighted to find out that we had an ongoing project, which was the having acquired a large collection of original cartoons from the cartoonist Bill Mauldin, we had a three-pronged project, which was an exhibition, a documentary, and a wonderful book looking at Mauldin, his life and times and career, illustrated with some of the cartoons. And Mauldin is in many ways the quintessential citizen soldier, experiences World War II as an infantryman originally, and then as a cartoonist, and begins to build his fame almost as a social commentator and editorial cartoonist, grounded in his experience in World War II. So we had this wonderful project ongoing, and I was delighted to come on board and be part of it. And Todd DePastino, who came on to assist us, is one of the foremost authorities on the life and times of Bill Mauldin.
And Todd, how did you, and go back, how did you get involved in studying this subject?
Unlike Rob, I'm not a military historian. I don't have any background in the military, no family in the military, no real interest in the military. I was a social and cultural historian of the United States. I specialized in late 19th, early 20th century history. I wrote a book that had to do with the history of homelessness called Citizen Hobo. And as I was working on that book, I talked to a great uncle of mine who was in the Army, in the Armored Division in Europe. And I was saying that hobos just disappeared with World War II. And he laughed and said, no, they didn't disappear. They went into the Army. They got drafted. He said, I served with them. And he said, Willie and Joe, Bill Mauldin's cartoons. Those are really just a couple of hobos in olive drab. And man, that reference made me kind of look up Mauldin's cartoons. And I had seen them before. I think I'd actually just known it from the Charles Schulz reference. Every Veterans Day, Charles Schulz would put Snoopy in his World War I Flying Ace outfit or his World War II garrison cap, and Snoopy would go out and quaff a few root beers with Bill Mauldin. And that's really all I knew about it. I got the book up front, I started to read it, and I read it in one sitting. And then this is Bill Mauldin's, bestseller of 1945. And then I started it again. And this time I started reading it really closely because I realized, first of all, the images, it's, 120 some cartoons and maybe 25,000, 50,000 words of text, maybe. The drawings are gripping, they're absorbing, they are masterful, they are unlike anything that I'd ever seen coming out of World War II before. The humor, though, is arcane. It comes from a subculture of the infantry, and I probably understood maybe 1 out of every 5 cartoons. I wanted to unlock the code. I wanted to understand the humor behind all this. I knew that there was some kind of gripping trauma behind the humor. Gripping trauma. And it was learning that language and kind of understanding the art and understanding Mauldin's experience of war on the front lines that just kind of pulled me into the project. And I couldn't believe, as a historian, I went to find out more about Mauldin, and I found very little. I mean, there were a lot of magazine articles about him and newspaper articles, and it seemed like every World War II veteran left alive had some kind of special tribute to Mauldin because he meant so much to them. But in terms of scholarship, there really wasn't much. And the more I thought maybe I'd do a scholarly article on him, but the more I learned about him and his charismatic life and his kind of crazy personality, I thought this warrants a biography, and that's what got me started.
So, Rob, I see that or if I'm not mistaken, the museum has thousands of his cartoons. Is that correct? And how did the museum get so many?
Yes, we do indeed. We have in the region of nearly 5,000 editorial cartoons from 58 to 91, another 118 original cartoons from his back home book, and 7 original Willie and Joe cartoons, and we're looking at potentially receiving some more from the Mauldin family. The connection with the Pritzker Military Museum and Library and Bill Mauldin is a complex one and a fascinating one. The museum and library was founded by Colonel Jennifer Pritzker, who served some 27 odd years in the United States military, United States Army, and Illinois National Guard. But Colonel Pritzker came to Bill Mauldin courtesy of a copy of his up front that her father had, and Colonel Pritzker became fascinated by the cartoons of Bill Mauldin from a very early age. And Colonel Pritzker's family has a long history of serving in the United States military, Army, and Navy. And so Colonel Pritzker was moved in much the same way as Todd indicated he was, by seeing these wonderful images. So Colonel Pritzker, as a young child, was moved by the images of Mauldin's experience in World War II. When the colonel serves in the military herself, she begins to get a better sense as to what that code really means, the code that Todd sort of alluded to just then. And Bill Mauldin spends time in Chicago, and Colonel Pritzker actually goes to school with some of Bill Mauldin's children. So there is a wonderful sort of connectivity there between seeing Mauldin, being inspired and captured and captivated by these wonderful illustrations that so many people are, military service on the part of Colonel Pritzker, the founding of a museum and library, an institution that is willing and able to home the types of images and the collection that the Mauldin family has, and that personal piece through the colonel's own father, and also knowing the Mauldin children at school in Chicago. So it's a wonderful confluence of circumstance, if you like. And in terms of the mission of the museum and library and the opportunity it affords with something like this book and the exhibition, it just tells this wonderful citizen soldier story in a fashion that is visually engaging, and as I said, captivating.
And I would assume this is the largest collection. The museum has the largest collection of his work.
Yes, we do. The Library of Congress has some elements of his work as well. The 45th Infantry Division Museum, which Mauldin serves in World War II, but the Pritzker Military Museum and Library is really the mother lode now of Mauldin cartoons and Mauldin materials.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the mother lode, and this is Todd chiming in, and I just want to say I'm so grateful as a scholar that the Pritzker Library and Museum and Library has had the foresight to collect the thousands of these Mauldin drawings. You know, I mean, I consider Mauldin one of the great 20th century American artists, but at the time, you know, his art was called cartoons, and cartoons aren't meant to be saved and preserved and collected and displayed. They're meant to be seen once and kind of thrown away with the, wrapped fish in it. I mean, this is ephemeral. This is very ephemeral art, and it wasn't intended really to be saved and collected and cared for. But it's so important that it is cared and collected and cared for. So I'm very grateful that the museum has embarked on this project, and I'm just stunned at the number of images they've been able to collect.
So considering the large size, what theme did you develop as you pared down what you included in the book?
Well, we tried to focus on the best of the art. I mean, this is a guy who is doing, just for the listeners who aren't familiar with the strange arc of Mauldin's career, this is a kid who came out of nowhere, the desert Southwest, didn't even graduate high school, joined the Arizona National Guard because he needed, 3 meals a day and a new suit of clothes. After Pearl Harbor, it gets activated as the 45th Infantry Division. He gets sent overseas with the 45th Division, gets plucked. He's a rifleman. He gets plucked from his unit and placed on Stars and Stripes, which had the largest circulation of any newspaper in the world at the time. He wins the Pulitzer Prize for the cartoons that he did for Stars and Stripes. He's the youngest Pulitzer Prize winner in history. By the time he comes home after the war in 1945, 300 newspapers around the country are printing his daily cartoons. And Mauldin, at age 23, he's a millionaire and a celebrity now. He decides he wants to retire, but the United Feature Syndicate won't let him out of his contract. So he continues to do cartooning daily cartooning until 1948. When he does retire, he steps out. He becomes an airplane pilot. He acts in Hollywood movies. He writes for Hollywood. He runs for Congress. And finally, in 1958, gets back into daily editorial political cartooning with a modulated different kind of style. And he cartoons for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and then for the Chicago Sun-Times for the next 35, 40 years. And he wins his second Pulitzer. He becomes kind of one of the deans of American political cartooning, right up there with Herblock at his peak in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. And so what we tried to do was to get a good representation of this really varied career that, in 45, he's doing Willie and Joe cartoons, and after the war, it's Willie and Joe, these two GIs on the home front. They're civilians trying to figure out how to be civilians. But the late 1950s, early 1960s, he's cartooning about Mao Zedong and Fidel Castro and Dwight Eisenhower and the Kennedys and he's traveling the world, really to hotspots around the world and kind of capturing in drawings and really insightful drawings and cartoons some of the geopolitical and dynamics also taking place on the national scene politically. And just one more thing for the listeners to keep in mind. This is a man who, when he was with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, he was doing 6 original cartoons a week. He had one day off. In other words, he had to wake up and be timely, insightful, and funny every single day. Yeah. And needless to say, he didn't do it. Not every single day. I mean, he did it maybe 4 days a week. The other 2, they're not so good. And in fact, every 10 years or so, he tended to repeat his best cartoons. This is a really demanding, grueling job. Really, really difficult. I mean, it took everything he had, and he gave everything to his art, to these cartoons. And so what we did is we selected the cartoons that we thought represented the best of his art, that had a message that would still resonate today, and that represented his different styles and different periods of his career.
I'm talking with Dr. Rob Havers, president of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, and Todd DePastino, editor of Drawing Fire. You can find more information on their work at pritzkermilitary.org and veteransbreakfastclub.org. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. If you want more military history ranging from the ancient to the modern, please visit warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter and keep up with my latest posts. You can also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at fullcontactnerd.com and technologyinspace.com. And now back to the podcast. So, Rob, let me ask you this. These cartoons, apart from being, talking about the human condition and also being amusing or entertaining, how much history, how much did they add to the knowledge of military history as far as what the common soldier had to deal with?
Bill Mauldin's representation of the experience of the infantryman, the common infantryman, the dogface as they were known, is incredibly timeless. he conveys through Willie and Joe the harsh reality of, and he serves in Italy, of the fighting in the soft underbelly of Europe. In military history terms, as I'm sure you know, the Allies believe mistakenly that going through Italy will provide potentially a quick end to the war up through that soft underbelly. The reality is that the terrain and the weather of Italy is played and employed by the German forces in a masterly defensive retreat. And the reality is that the overwhelming material superiority that the Allies possess in air power and in armor and in ammunition and in the logistical sinews to serve that war machine is largely negated by skillful German resistance and, as I said, that masterful employment of ground and terrain. The only way through is the old-fashioned way, the 2,000-year-plus history of the infantryman, individual men, individual units on the ground, fighting yard by yard. The impact on the men that do that fighting is psychologically and physically substantial. And in his cartoons of Willie and Joe, he conveys that reality in a visceral fashion. And he also contrasts it with what he sees as the complex hierarchical nature of the United States Army, and indeed all armies, but the way in which those men who are at the sharp end fight not only the enemy, but also those soldiers at the rear, and less than competent instruction from officers who may well not be totally au fait with the situation. And so Mauldin, in these brisk and economical cartoons, manages to put across the experience of the ordinary soldier, for which he earns undying gratitude from veterans who were there at the sharp end, and also earns the ire of the top brass on occasion. Famously, he is upbraided by General Patton himself for his representation of the officer class as being remote from the reality of the fighting. And so in terms of conveying military history, well, you can, and we have indeed, a whole library on the fighting in Italy and the US experience of that campaign. And yet in a few skillful visual representations, Bill Mauldin can encapsulate that. And thereby, I mean, the skill of any editorial cartoonist or any cartoonist in general is the ability to convey a complex situation masterfully, convincingly, in a brief illustration, and Mauldin does that so well. And so in terms of a contribution to an understanding of military history, this is a great entree for anybody that wants to understand what it was that American troops at the sharp end on the ground went through in that campaign.
Did he take any photographs to use as supporting materials?
No,
he did not. I'll let Todd speak to that piece, perhaps.
Yeah, no. I just want to thank Rob. Just gave a wonderful overview of the kind of historical importance of Mauldin and his work. But no, Mauldin how he'd work in Italy, and it's impossible to imagine Mauldin emerging from anywhere really, but the Italian campaign in World War II. Mauldin would go to the front lines for a week or maybe 2 weeks, and he would live there in the front lines, up front in the foxhole, sometimes maybe for 4 days, 5 days, sometimes for as many as 13, 14 days. All the while, he would kind of make sketches. He would write in a notebook certain ideas, and then he would go back for 2 weeks into the rear, to the comfort of Naples or Rome, wherever the rear was at the time, and he would do 2 weeks' worth of cartoons that he had just gotten from his trip up front. Then, after he had run out, he said he would usually try to squeeze out a few more rear echelon cartoons, because turned out it was a lot safer in the rear than it was up front. And it was terrifying to go up front. And he said he tried to imagine what the front was like, but whenever he stayed away too long from the front, his cartoons weakened. He lost it. He lost his vision. He lost his purpose. And he would have to screw up the courage to go to the front lines again. And he said, once you're there at the front, you're okay. It's terrifying, of course, but you're in the company of others who are also enduring it. He said it's getting there that's the hard part. It's actually arriving there, making the transition from the relative safety of the rear to the extreme danger of the front. And he once asked his mentor and friend Ernie Pyle, who was really Pyle, the Scripps Howard correspondent, very famous, probably the most read American writer in history, who did in words what Mauldin was doing in pictures. He once asked Ernie Pyle, like, how do you do it? How do you keep going back up front? And Pyle said, we drink. We get drunk, we go up front, and by the time we get there, we're pretty drunk. And that's how Mauldin started his drinking habit. And that's how he would work. He would then go up front and then keep on shuttling back and forth from the rear to the front. And that kind of contrast of life in the rear and the life up front is in his cartoons always. I mean, that is one of the driving themes of his cartoons, is the difference between those up front and those in the relative safety of the rear. And I think you have to remember that most Americans during World War II, and probably even today, didn't really understand what the infantry was. The infantry was not getting much publicity. In fact, one thing that every side in World War II agreed on, for all they disagreed on, one thing that they all agreed on was they didn't want a replay of World War I. They didn't want a replay of slogging it out in the trenches on the ground. So every side envisioned a war that would be, spearheaded with armor or with air power, or long-range artillery or, naval power. But we weren't going to slog it out with, millions of boots on the ground. But that's exactly how the war did devolve in Italy, in the Italian campaign. That campaign up the rugged boot of Italy, there was no amount of firepower, no amount of air power that was going to dislodge the Germans from their bunkers in the mountains. It would have to be done the hard way, one boot at a time, and that's where Mauldin found himself. And that's why his two infantry grunts, the dog faces, Willie and Joe, that's why they became icons of World War II, because the war did devolve down in the end to infantry. And infantry had gotten no publicity for its role in the war in the early years of the war. I mean, even, naval construction battalions had their own John Wayne movie. There are tons of Bond posters and publicity posters trumpeting the role of Marines and, of course, glamorous flyboys. But the infantry, that's where you went, if you couldn't read and write. That's where you went if you, never graduated high school. That's where you went if you didn't have any skills to contribute to the war effort in any other way. And so they weren't given much publicity. It was Mauldin that gave them the publicity.
So not to say that you need a formal education or anything to be successful at this, but how does a young kid who I think you said didn't graduate high school, how does he develop such awareness, that can create cartoons that touch people like this, and either of you?
Gosh, the mystery of genius. What do you say, Rob?
I'll take the easy questions, Todd. That's a good synopsis. It is the mystery of genius. I mean, if you look at Bill Mauldin's life, it's the definition of hard scrabble. He grows up with very little. He sort of pulls himself up by his breeches or bootstraps, literally. He borrows money from his grandmother to enroll in art school in Chicago, one of the few art schools that allows you to enroll without finishing high school. But he early on has, I think, possibly self-identified the fact that he can draw very adeptly, and that he is possessed of. And I think we talk in the book the fact that when he's in the army, his IQ is rated as the highest in his unit, so he possesses this innate spark of intelligence, and cartooning and the adeptness that he brings to the visual word, if you like. It's just that combination and that upbringing somehow. It's what he understands best, and he can convey things in a fashion that few can, and that it's a route to fame and fortune that you could not prescribe. But when you look at the individual pieces, you can quite see how it is that he gets where he goes and what he does, I think.
Yeah.
What would you say, Todd?
Yeah, he was absolutely tremendously ambitious from the time he was a little child. He was a troublemaker. He was a terror. He had a foul attitude. He was a diminutive kid. He got into more fights on the mountain that he grew up in than anybody else, and he lost every one of them. He just was a holy terror, and he also was something of a prodigy. And his parents, his mother especially and grandmother, recognized that this kid could accomplish any academic task you gave him. I mean, he's reading novels at age 5. He's doing elaborate drawings even before that. He's wonderful at math. They kind of dream that he might become a surgeon. He dreams that maybe he'll become a preacher, a famous preacher, an engineer. I mean, he loved railroads, all that kind of stuff. But he was a poor kid. He was a hillbilly from New Mexico. He knew he was never going to be able to afford any kind of education that would get him a career like that. He also knew that probably his easiest skill, the thing that came most naturally to him, was drawing. But he was never going to be able to, afford the kind of years and years of tutoring to become a fine artist. But he did read an article in Popular Mechanics that you can make a boatload of dough by doing cartoons, and that the creator of Blondie and the creator of Popeye, they were making $100,000 a year, and at age 14 he thought that sounded pretty good, and so he really focused from the time he was really a child on becoming a cartoonist. When he enrolled for his 1 year at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts, and just like Rob said, it was the only school that would take a high school dropout. He had to promise that he would be a fine artist, a painter, and of course he wasn't. He was studying the whole time to be a cartoonist, and he would do 10 original cartoons a night. He would not go to sleep until he submitted to magazines 10 original cartoons every single night, and he did it for 1 year every single night. I mean, that translates into thousands of cartoons. He trained himself to do it. He worked really, really, really hard, because he wanted to make a pile of dough, and he also wanted recognition. I think he wanted people to pay attention to him. I think he wanted to get people's attention. And he had a special eye for those who were down and out, for those who are on the sharp end of life, for those who were, overlooked. He felt he was overlooked. And so he was always kind of a champion of the downtrodden. And that, along with his ambition, really fueled his career.
What did he do to get onto Stars and Stripes?
He, from the time he joined, from the first few months that he joined the 45th Infantry Division in 1940, just when he joined, the division started a newspaper called the 45th Division News. It was an experiment to try and boost soldiers' morale. He immediately saw that they didn't have a cartoon. He volunteered to be a cartoonist. He thought that it might liberate him from the drudgery of the kind of quartermaster corps he was working in. And he found that he was given one afternoon off a week to do the cartoon. He got one afternoon training off, Friday afternoon. And he made the most of it. I mean, he quickly became one of the most popular men in the 45th Infantry Division because he was reflecting their lives back to them. The mud, the marches, the drill sergeants, the equipment, the drudgery, the leaky tents. The drudgery of life in the infantry at Fort Sill, Oklahoma at the time. It just made him a legend in the division. And it was a fascinating, interesting, probably the most ethnically diverse infantry division that we had in World War II, because there were a whole lot of Native Americans, American Indians in that division.
So, Rob, let me ask you this. Since the book, from the description, the book says that it includes cartoons from other hotspots in the U.S. and around the world, following World War II. Can you tell me a little bit about what he did in those hotspots, his involvement with that?
Yes, indeed. As Todd said, there's a commonality, really, if you like, in terms of subjects that Bill focuses on. So he looks at the infantry, the sort of where the rubber hits the road in terms of closing with the enemy and killing him. And throughout the rest of his career, he's often focused on those areas, especially in U.S. life, where underserved populations deserve more visibility. So his time in Chicago and St. Louis, he's looking at some of the big challenging social movements of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, equal rights for women, desegregation, the big issues that the United States deals with. But he is also returning to his roots essentially as a war correspondent. He spends time in Korea during the Korean War in the early 1950s. He goes to Vietnam at the very beginning of U.S. involvement in that conflict. His own son is serving as a helicopter pilot there. He comes under fire once again in Vietnam, not the Germans this time, but the North Vietnamese. He spends time in the Middle East. He is there in May of 1967, days before the Six-Day War that recasts that part of the world decisively. And his final conflict, really, or his final time as a war correspondent, is the first Gulf War, Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So Bill Mauldin, from that beginning in Italy, is really the genius of Mauldin is then seen narrating conflicts around the world for the next 40 odd years, and conflicts at home, domestic considerations as well.
Yeah. He really had a knack for finding war wherever it was, for being at a place where a riot was going to break out, or a battle was going to break out. I mean, just like Rob said, he arrives in Vietnam, and originally in Saigon in the last week of January 1965. He goes to a remote place nobody's ever heard of called Pleiku, where Camp Holloway is, the 52nd Aviation Battalion. And he arrives there on February 7th, 1965, just to visit his son, has a few drinks with his son, goes to bed in his hooch, and is woken up by explosions. That at 2 a.m. It's the attack at Pleiku. It's kind of an important turning point in the war. He's the only correspondent there. He's not really there as a correspondent. He takes pictures. He makes notes. He tends to the wounded. He loads people into C-123s to be evacuated in the wee hours of the morning. And there he is. The whole country's eyes are upon him because he's the only one reporting from Pleiku about this serious Viet Cong attack. And he just seems to do that over and over and over again. He's in Oxford, Mississippi, he just happens to be there when James Meredith is being admitted as a student and a huge riot breaks out. He's in Chicago, of course, for the Democratic National Convention in August 1968. As Rob said, he goes to Korea in 52. He just happens to be in Israel when the Six-Day War begins, and it just happens over and over again. He really has a nose for crisis, and as I said in the biography, when there wasn't one that he could cover, he would try and stir one up himself.
There's a great exhibition at the National Infantry Museum down at Fort Benning that looks at the history of the role of the infantrymen in the United States Army from colonial time to the present day. And the sort of one of the centerpiece parts of the exhibition is something called the last 100 yards. And it's something you can only do in the space that a museum display offers. And it's essentially the National Infantry Museum demonstrating to the wider American public, those who have served and those who have not, that the role of the infantryman is essentially, once the artillery is done, the air support is over, once the precision-guided munitions have done their bit, that last 100 yards is what the infantryman covers on his own with his section or company or platoon. It's the sharp end, literally. And Bill Mauldin, as that infantryman, experienced that. And if you use that as an analog, if you like, for the rest of his life, Bill Mauldin is there covering that last 100 yards in Korea, in Vietnam, the Six-Day War, the Gulf War, Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 68, James Meredith in Mississippi. Bill Mauldin is there. Those last 100 yards, whatever the cause, whatever the fight, that's where you find Bill Mauldin. And that really is so apparent in his work, I think.
Gosh, is that a great way of looking at it? That's a great way of conceiving it. I think I'm going to steal that from you, Rob, and use that because
more than welcome.
It's so true. He has very little patience for kind of the abstractions of war and of peace with honor, appeasement, the domino theory. I mean, he has very little patience for that kind of abstraction. For him, life came down, conflict came down, war always came down to the personal, the intimate, the individuals involved, the pound of flesh that it took from those who were in it, who were up front. That was the focus of his work and the focus of his career. That's what it always came down to. If you were going to justify a war, you better justify what it does to those who are up front.
I'm talking with Dr. Rob Havers, president of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, and Todd DePastino, editor of Drawing Fire. You can find more information on their work at pritzkermilitary.org and veteransbreakfastclub.org. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. If you want more military history ranging from the ancient to the modern, please visit warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter and keep up with my latest posts. You can also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at fullcontactnerd.com and technologyinspace.com. Now back to the podcast. Maybe you sort of answered this question, but I'll ask it. Would you consider him, either of you, would you say he's more of an adrenaline junkie or more of a social worker, or just a mix?
If you had to choose between the two, I'd say more the adrenaline junkie.
Because, yeah, he seems...
But it's more nuanced than that. I mean, right. I do think that he was a crisis-driven personality, and I'm sorry if I'm stepping on Rob, but his work is absolutely better when he's in a crisis. It's remarkable. It's absolutely remarkable. The worse things get in war or on the home front, the better his art is. And it just happens over and over again. When he's comfortable, when not much is happening, he loses his edge. I mean, and I think he recognized that in himself. And I think it was detrimental to his personal life. I mean, it's hard to be the son or the wife or the, family member of somebody who's chasing around war and riot and conflict all the time. And it was. I mean, I think his lifestyle was hard on his family. But his art was the better for it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Todd. I think that there is a strong social conscience apparent in all of Mauldin's work. From the very beginning to the very end, but and again, it comes back to that sort of that earlier analogy about that last 100 yards when the crisis is at its height. That's where Mauldin likes to be, and that's where he is the most productive, the most insightful, and the most incisive in terms of the images that he is conveying.
Mm-hmm. And I asked that because one of you said that he was considering being a preacher when he was a young kid. So that's why I was wondering about the whole caring for others, the social worker aspect.
Yeah, he certainly cared for others. I mean, he was a crusader.
Right.
He was, he was somebody who had to always be fighting a battle on behalf of the underdog. That's what motivated him in life. And I think he thought as a child, maybe as a preacher, he could do something like that. And he also, he wanted attention. He wanted the world to recognize him. He wanted to be recognized, I think, for the genius that he was, to put it simply. Although it is, I want to say, we call him a cartoonist. And I always struggled when I was working on the biography with that. And I think that's something he struggled with too. He was asked what he was, and he would say, I'm a cartoonist, and that means that I'm not good enough to be an artist. And I think that was always at the front of his mind, that he always had this chip on his shoulder. He was not educated. He was not, he hadn't gone through art school to a degree. He was just a cartoonist, but of course he was much more than a cartoonist, and his work is much more than a bunch of ephemeral cartoons. They really are collectively, his 700-odd World War II cartoons are a masterpiece of 20th century American art. I remember talking to Stanley Meltzoff, who was another illustrator for Stars and Stripes, one of Mauldin's colleagues, when I was working on the book. And Meltzoff said, yeah, cartoonist is too little a word for what Mauldin was. Artist might be too exalted a word. I call him a picture maker. He was a picture maker. And I think that's a decent fit. He was a picture maker, and what he pictured was really a huge swath of 20th century America.
What, either published or unpublished, what was his most detailed or expansive work? Do you know?
His most detailed or expansive work? I would say probably his World War II work. I mean, he was immersed in it for years. I mean, he was immersed in the life up front for years. And so that is kind of the most detailed and immersive work that he did. Now Mauldin he had a certain kind of a genius. He was not someone he was a fine writer, by the way, a very good writer, but he tried to write novels, could never do it. He tried to write plays, could never do it. He tried to do oil paintings, couldn't really do it. He was not somebody who was going to be able to kind of sit quietly in a room and, delve into his imagination to create this great work of art. He had to be out in the world, mixing it up. And so everything he did kind of in interaction with his environment. It wasn't an experiment, a formal experiment that he was doing with his, aesthetic imagination. It was him kind of mixing it up with ordinary people out in the world. And that's how he worked. And the more he mixed it up, the better his work was. And I would say that, yeah, his most kind of consistent, immersive work was the work he did with the infantry in World War II.
And actually, yeah, I like that answer, but I was actually wondering about, was there any individual pieces, that maybe, that had the most detail compared to any others?
Yeah, I could think of a few. Every once in a while. Because, of course, as a cartoonist, what Mauldin said is the fewer lines you have to use, the better. The fewer words you have to use, the better. In fact, the perfect cartoon is one with no caption. You could just see it at an instant. And I mean, if you think about how people consume cartoons, not comic art, but cartoons in the newspaper, historically, you want to glance at it, get the point, chuckle, and then move on. And so that was his audience. However, as a comic artist, he did sometimes do really involved detail work. For example, I mean, he did a beautiful drawing of an elaborate Gothic church in Spain, for example, in the 1950s. That he did for Collier's magazine. He did also for the 45th Division News. He did a special 2-page spread, a Christmas spread that was very detailed look, kind of a humorous look of a GI's, day in the life of a GI in the winter of 1943. So he would take time at the drawing board to, fill in incredible detail, but he was always working not to fill in, but to take out, to make it as spare as possible, to get the point across with as few lines as possible.
Okay. Rob, when you were going through the archives or the collection, well, tell me what that was like, and what did you find that was most surprising to you?
Well, I give full credit to our wonderful curators at the museum and library here who know the collection far better than I. And I've really only glimpsed some of the highlights. I think what has struck me, and Todd touched on it there, and Todd discusses it in the book, is the way in which Mauldin was able to adapt his style to circumstance. There's a wonderful vignette in the book that talks about how Mauldin relocates back to the West Coast and begins to using an early, and I won't say prototypical, but an early fax machine to send his cartoons in rather than being on site, and so is required to adapt that sort of how he conveys the images to the demands of a facsimile machine that doesn't pick up detail terribly effectively. And so if you look at Mauldin's cartoons from beginning to end, they evolve undoubtedly, but there is always the sort of sense that he is capturing somehow he is conveying in a fashion that makes the most sense at the time, and he is neither constrained by a particular style, although a Mauldin is always recognizable, and he seems eminently adaptable. And I think again that visual that artistic adaptability that's conveyed in the visual nature of the cartoons is sort of reflective of his life too, which is one that really is pretty adaptable from that hard scrabble youth, as we talked about, to candidate for Congress, movie star, double Pulitzer Prize winner. There's a sort of shape-shifting ability of Mauldin himself that is reflected in the cartoons themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, Rob. So with a military museum, and you can use the Mauldin exhibit as part of the answer, how do you balance between exhibits that maybe aren't as popular with the public but are important to show versus those which draw larger crowds and but maybe take up more time or space than other exhibits which you'd like to show?
Well, I think the challenge of an organization like ours is that you have to find a way in for general audiences as well as those who know the material more fully. One of the key planks of our mission is to be a bridge between those who have served, those who serve, and indeed those who will serve, and the civilian populace of this country. The percentage of those who have served in the military in the United States at the moment is not quite at an all-time low, but it is comparatively low, and service tends to run in families. Colonel Pritzker is a good example of this. So you come from a family where your grandfather, your father has served, you yourself may serve, your daughter may serve, and so there is it's a cloistered world in some sense, and military history itself can be somewhat impenetrable to some people, and so opportunities to reach people where they are well served by the likes of a Bill Mauldin cartoon. We talked a lot earlier about the specific nature, the slog of the campaign in Italy. It doesn't get the movie attention that D-Day, the 6th of June, Normandy has had. And so how do you get people interested in that? Something like a Mauldin exhibition provides an entree to that. And we also referenced earlier the wonderful way the Infantry Museum conveys that last 100 yards. Those are the kind of things you can, however, do in a museum space. So the Bill Mauldin collection for our institution is a wonderful vehicle both to convey the complexities of life in the military and also the broader post-war period that has seen military service all around the globe.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know which of you is best to answer this, but how did you get sort of the many celebrities that did essays for the book? How did you get those individuals?
Well, I can speak to this a little bit, and then I'm sure Todd can jump in. We have a great array of authors. Two that stand out, of course, I think, that your audience would know. Tom Hanks, who writes a wonderful preface. Tom Brokaw also writes a contribution. Tom Brokaw, of course, who needs no introduction, but author of The Greatest Generation, has an understanding of that generation that fights and wins the Second World War, and is himself a child of World War II and was very influenced by Mauldin. Tom Hanks, too. He has served in uniform on our screens for decades, perhaps most memorably as Captain Miller in Saving Private Ryan. Both of these individuals believed that Mauldin was an individual who needed to be known more fully. And our book and our exhibition and documentary, we intend will bring Mauldin to new generations as well as interest those who do know Mauldin. But neither of those individuals with their huge reputations needed much convincing, because they have a passion for Mauldin for many of the very many reasons Todd and I have tried to articulate, and simply wanted to have that on record and wanted to pass that passion on. We also have Jean Schultz, the widow of Chuck Schultz, the the creator of Peanuts, who also wanted to make a contribution and connect those two great cartoonists. And Todd mentioned some of their connectivity earlier on. So it was not a difficult sell. We are very grateful to all our authors for what they have written. But it was, I nearly said a crime of passion. It's not a crime, but they were motivated by their own enthusiasm for Mauldin himself.
Absolutely.
and simply wanted another vehicle in which to convey that. So it was one of the easiest sells that we've ever had, and I think Todd would probably agree.
Yeah, was it? Yeah, didn't have to twist their arms. I mean, Tom Brokaw also said that he owed Mauldin for being a model of journalism, the kind of, crusading journalism that inspired him to get into that line of work. And I have to say, just what Rob said, that to reiterate what Rob said, that I think what attracted them all to the Mauldin project was the fact that Mauldin and his work really does make the inscrutable relatable. It makes the intimidating understandable. It bridges that gap between the civilian world and the military world. There really is a severe military-civilian divide that has only gotten bigger over the years. And, I'm Exhibit A. I'm a civilian and really had very little understanding of the military world. Working on Bill Mauldin's cartoons not only opened my eyes to what it's like not only to be in war, but to serve in the military, it changed my life. I mean, I ended up quitting my job as a professor and founding the Veterans Breakfast Club, which is a platform where we hold events where veterans can come and share their stories with the public. It's a nonprofit whose mission really is to close that gap, to give veterans a chance to kind of talk about their transformative experiences serving in the military. And it's something that, we're still doing today, 12 years later, virtually online with Veterans Breakfast Club events, and everybody's welcome to come and hear the stories. And it really all, from my perspective, goes back to kind of Mauldin taking this distant, difficult to understand, unrelatable experience and making it something that I could relate to.
He must have had a lot, or it seems, I would assume he experienced a great deal of trauma and perhaps tragedy in his life, at least losing maybe people he knew or friends or something like that. Was that the case?
Oh, yeah. Bad. Yeah. I mean, he had a pretty traumatic childhood also. I mean, he left home at age 14. He and his older brother, age 15, pulled an old Model T out of the family junk pile, got it running until it broke down in Phoenix. They started a new life in Phoenix, Arizona, living on the front porch of a boarding house, painting signs, taking odd jobs, until he finally had to join the National Guard just to kind of keep his belly full. But war was a real trauma for him. It's kind of undescribable, the kind of horror and brutality that he witnessed. I mean, the 45th Infantry Division alone had a 400% turnover rate. I mean, it was, he would go to the front lines and visit his old unit and go away, come back 2 weeks later, and they were all new men. They were all replacements because every single one on the front lines had been killed or wounded. It was a trauma that he tried hard to deal with and to put away. And what made it kind of worse psychologically was that he was profiting off the war. He was becoming rich and famous. They were dying. And he was spared their fate only because of his talent. And he knew that. And it made him redouble his effort to devote his cartoons to them, to kind of try to tell the world what was happening to those men up front. And it was something that never left him. I think he was always trying to outrun it. He was alcoholic, heavy drinker, his whole life, a kind of a binge drinker. That was undoubtedly related to the war. He never could quite escape it.
So, Rob, I'll ask you this first. So we've talked a lot about, what the book does, the goals, and this sort of thing. What would you add to that as far as what you hope the book will do for readers?
Well, the book, I hope, will bring Mauldin alive to a host of a new generation, essentially. And by new generation, I don't necessarily mean the young, but those who have grown up in the post-war period may remember Mauldin cartoons in the newspapers, but also to indicate both the sort of the extent to which, if history doesn't repeat itself, I think Mark Twain said this, it most certainly rhymes. And there are consistent themes that Bill Mauldin addressed in different conflicts that he returned to again and again, because there is a constancy or a consistency in some of the challenges that humanity faces decade on decade. We are grappling at the moment in 2020 with concerns about racial justice and injustice in society, the same kind of things that Mauldin saw in the 1960s, the same kinds of things that he witnessed in New Mexico in the 1930s and indeed in World War II. So it's to demonstrate that there is a continuity in the human experience. There is a positivity in it, in that there is Mauldin often, in capturing the worst, also hints at the best of humanity. And I think fundamentally it is what we would like to achieve with the book is simply for more people to understand who Bill Mauldin is and was and what he could do, and to be inspired by that. But also just simply to remember him. Bill Mauldin deserves to be better known today. And this is our small contribution to ensuring that. And given that, as we commented earlier on, we are the mother lode now of Mauldin materials, we hope to stimulate greater interest from researchers, from those who come and to either host our temporary exhibition when it tours the country, visit our exhibition when it opens in the spring of 2021, look at our documentary and be inspired in a way. Understand what Mauldin did, but be inspired also to make a difference in your own life.
Mm-hmm. Todd, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say that you could do worse. If you wanted to cover kind of American and world history from, say, Pearl Harbor to the fall of the Berlin Wall, you could do worse than to leaf through, 50 years of Bill Mauldin's cartoons. I mean, it's a real education. It's fun. It's insightful. You learn a lot. And you learn a lot about what you thought you knew, but you maybe have forgotten about the, certain distinctive relationship that, say, Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon had as president and vice president. You forget the complicated relationship that, say, China and North Korea had during the Korean War. All these kind of nuances are just brought out beautifully in these cartoons, and I think it's a reminder not only that Mauldin is best known for his World War II work, but he continued to do just premier work in the decades after, and also just what the great age of political or editorial cartooning really was like. How much was captured in a simple frame and a simple caption.
Mm-hmm. Was he very involved with cartoonist organizations?
I'd say yes. Yes, he was. He was feted and awarded, and he would often go to the National Association of editorial cartoonist conventions. He had many friends who were cartoonists, Charles Schulz among others, Mike Peters. He helped mentor Mother Goose and Grimm, cartoonist. He was very generous with the younger generation. Gary Trudeau, I think, would say he owed much to Mauldin. He gave of himself in later years. Good. Pat Oliphant.
Mm-hmm. Chris, and I think just to piggyback on what both Todd and I have said, there is an accessibility to Bill Mauldin's cartoons. You can look at those images and they draw you in. And I think what we'd like to accomplish as well is that these cartoons in and of themselves on display in our exhibition or through this book, they will prompt those who see them to think again about history, to want to find out more about, for example, the Six-Day War or even the assassination of JFK on the back of the way in which Mauldin conveyed those events at the time. And so they're an aid and that entry point to a study of history, which is what an organization like ours is always about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd say that's very valuable to do. Very important. Were there any difficulties in getting the book finished or published?
Well, you always have to corral the writers to get their copy in time, but and I'm one of the writers, so I'm criticizing myself here. But I think really, I mean, from my perspective, from the editor's perspective, it's a matter of which cartoons to choose. I mean, out of the 5,000 odd cartoons we reviewed, we could only select 150. And it's a tough selection process, but I think we managed to get a good representation.
Mm-hmm. Does the museum publish many books?
Yeah, Pritzker Military Museum and Library has a long history of publishing books on military history topics, often grounded in collections we have in the museum and library. Most recently, we published a book called Zero to Hero about the experiences of Alan J. Lynch, a local Chicagoland Medal of Honor winner from the Vietnam War. We are in the early phases of publishing a book called 100 Cities, 100 Memorials, which commemorates a project we were involved with as part of the World War I Centennial Commission to provide funds and support to refurbish 100 separate World War I memorials that have fallen into disarray. And other books include the General, about the experiences of Major General Levine, who was one of the first American soldiers into the concentration camps. We also published a book called Lest We Forget, grounded in our poster collection that looked at the U.S. involvement and indeed World War I itself. So this is the latest in a long line of substantial contributions to military history and to an understanding of the military.
So a quick aside to that, I actually went looking. Apparently in D.C. they I don't know, planted or placed bricks, white bricks for World War I casualties, D.C. casualties, all along Connecticut Avenue, I think it was. They're all grown over, but I think I came across one or two stones, just totally smoothed over at this point. But yeah, I think there's a memorial there that I don't think many people know about at all.
No, indeed, and the sort of culminating, the final entry in 100 Cities, 100 Memorials is the World War I Centennial Commission Memorial in D.C. But you're absolutely right. In many towns and cities across this country, great or small, there are often unremarked and unnoticed commemorations of that sacrifice 100 years ago, and so bringing those to life, and thereby the sacrifice and the contribution of those who fought in that conflict. That was that project in essence.
Mm-hmm. And Todd, do you have any writing projects coming up?
Oh, I'm always writing something. Yeah, with the Veterans Breakfast Club, we're a media production company, so we're always writing something digitally or doing a video or online. There is a book project that I am working on that is a biography of the artist Don Freeman, who was a really important social realist in the 1930s and 40s, but he became famous much later as a children's writer, and he wrote the book Corduroy. And it's a wonderful children's book, and it's the story of his kind of remarkable life and his transformation into a children's author.
So where, and Rob, I'll let you answer first. Where can people find you or your museum online?
Online, you can find us at pritzkermilitary.org, and you can find us in person at 104 South Michigan Avenue in the heart of Chicago. We are open, somewhat restricted hours, but we have a exhibition looking at the end of World War II, the Allied Road to Victory, and we will have in the spring of 2021 our Mauldin exhibition that will look in greater detail at many of the themes and the images that we have discussed today.
And I believe you have a YouTube channel where you post...
We do. We have a YouTube channel, and if you use our website as a starting point, you can see many programs looking at all aspects of military history and the U.S. military in war and peace across all branches and all time periods. A lot of good programs, a lot of symposia, and you heard me distill some of our publications, but a lot of great resources if you have an interest in military history.
And Todd, do you have a website or social media for your work?
Yes, indeed. VeteransBreakfastClub.org is our website, and our social media is, of course, Veterans Breakfast Club on Facebook, and we have a YouTube channel, and we do 4 programs a week. We do Veterans Breakfast Club Live on Wednesday mornings. We do Veterans Breakfast Club Live Happy Hour on Friday evenings. We do The Greatest Generation Live on the weekend, and then we have a podcast, The Scuttlebutt. And we are, we're all virtual now. Everybody's welcome to join us, and it's quite fun. We just get veterans together and have them share stories and have people ask some questions.
That sounds pretty fascinating.
Oh, it's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
Good.
And of necessity, we are virtual too with our programs, but Pritzker Military Presents is our signature television program shown on PBS in Chicago and increasingly PBS networks across the country. And we're also doing Pritzker Military Presents on the home front, roughly once a week presentation, discussion on topics of military history and military civil relations. So find us on our website.
Excellent. So that's all the questions I have. Do either of you have any final thoughts or words?
No, I think that was a good discussion, Chris.
Yeah,
Todd, thank you.
It was a good discussion, and I think we realized at some point in this project that next year, 2021, was going to be the year of the Bill Mauldin centennial. He would have been 100 years old, and so I think it's a fitting kind of tribute to him, this Drawing Fire, the editorial cartoons of Bill Mauldin. I'm grateful that the Pritzker Museum decided to do it and invited me to be a part of it.
All right. Well, thank you both for speaking with me.
Thank you, Chris.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
And now for the bonus clips. The first one is taken from my podcast, Technology in Space, where I interviewed John B. Herrington, and he talks about starting out as a naval aviator and getting into the astronaut program. So your progression from naval aviator to astronaut, was it sort of a premeditated, a planned progression, or how did that go?
Well, it started off, I joined the Navy because I tutored a guy in calculus who was a Navy captain who flew Dauntless dive bombers in World War II. And he convinced me to join the Navy. I flew as a kid, but it wasn't until much later that I actually thought, well, I could do this for a career. And I joined the Navy, and I went off and I hunted Russian submarines for a few years. I used to dream about it as a kid. I used to play in a cardboard box dream I was going to the moon. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until I was in my first squadron. When I realized if I wanted to be an astronaut, I'd need to stay in the Navy and go to test pilot school. And then, you have to apply to it. It's a very competitive thing. I applied a couple times. And when I got there, I realized that, hey, all those people I watched on TV back in the 60s, half of them were Navy test pilots. Oh, by the way, their names are on the plaques of all the graduates. So you start seeing names like John Young, Alan Shepard, Gene Cernan, all these guys, Jim Lovell. These are all naval aviators, and they were naval test pilots. And so if you don't apply, you won't be an astronaut. Mm-hmm. And I needed a master's degree, so I changed my career path in Navy so they would send me to get a master's degree. And they did. They sent me to Monterey, and I got a master's in aeronautical engineering, and applied a couple times, and I was very fortunate to get an interview, and I guess they liked my story, and they could go to space with me for a couple weeks and not, that I wouldn't be too chatty, but yeah.
So at what point did it hit you like, wow, this could actually happen? I could realize my dreams, like where in that? Well,
it's not that I realized that I could do that when I got a phone call, and said, hey, come down and we'll interview you. Mm-hmm. But it was the idea is that I applied, knowing if I didn't apply, I wouldn't have any chance. Mm-hmm. But I applied with the possibility, but I just thought it was a really, really slim, it's a slim possibility. Mm-hmm. But I had the requisite, I did well in my squadrons. I had, decent grades, maybe not early on, but I figured it out later on, and I did well on my master's degree. And so I think NASA looked at it and said, does he have the requisite, skill set? And like say, can we go camping with this guy for 2 weeks and get along with him? You could be this I tell people, you can be the smartest person in class, but if you can't work well with others, NASA's not going to hire you. Mm-hmm. So be competent, be a good communicator, be a good team player, have a good solid background in something that NASA could utilize in their interest, and then that you can go through that little wicket, and I think I did.
The second clip is from my podcast Full Contact Nerd, where I speak to author and comic book writer M.R. Carey about a military robot he put in his latest novel, The Book of Koli. Did you have to do any research as you wrote this?
A little bit, not a huge amount. I did some geographical research. I wanted the geography of the Calder Valley and the geography of Koli's journey to make sense, but that wasn't a huge deal. And I did some research into, for example, one of the characters, Ursula, who we meet in the first book, has a robot, a tame robot that follows along behind her, and it's a military robot. She calls it the Drudge, and it's like a horse with no head. It's a sort of big, bulky metal body and 4 spindly metal legs, and a little gun mounted amidships, as it were, and that's based on existing technology. Those robots are being trialed now by the U.S. Army, and we've seen some quite scary footage of what the prototypes look like and what they can do. So I looked at that footage, and I looked at the sort of what we know about the specification of those particular machines. But an awful lot of it is just invented by whole cloth, as it were.
Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. If you want more military history ranging from the ancient to the modern, please visit warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter and keep track of my latest posts. You can also find written interviews and my social media links there. Thanks for listening.